Hello, welcome to another Shut At an Angle show here on Facebook. It's 7 o'clock on a Wednesday. You can tell it's 7 o'clock on a Wednesday because I'm doing a show again. I'm here every week talking about creativity and mostly about photography and giving you some ideas about maybe the direction you want to take your own photography in. Yeah, that's really what this show is about. Yeah, it's creative. It can be eclectic. It is mostly unscripted. I've got a guide that I follow, so I like to keep it nice and relaxed and friendly, and just anybody can join and listen, especially if you're interested in photography. Sometimes challenging as well. I try to challenge you as a photographer or as a creative. But anyway, anybody who's watching this is welcome to watch. Yes, my usual stellar intro. It's been a tiring week for some reason. I felt very tired. I came home. I was home about 6 o'clock, and I went to sleep about 6:30, and then suddenly realised it was half past. It was 6. It was 6 o'clock. It was 5:30, and it suddenly was 6 o'clock. No, Stuart, I'm still not in my hut. We've had a few technical difficulties there, but I'm sure we can figure it out. Keep watching the show. That's all I can say. And thanks for coming on, Stuart, because I know that you've been on the Mic Club, or you probably, I don't know. Are you doing both at the same time? Anyway, today's topic. I'm going to go straight into it today because I want you to think about this as if you're really interested in photography. The question is how well do you know your camera? So how well do you know its functions? I've talked about this previously in previous episodes where I find it really important to really get to know your camera as best as you possibly can do. Getting to know your camera is, I would say, is the most important step you can take to improve your photography. I find some photographers like to look for the next camera they can buy and look for the next bit of equipment to think, okay, but if I just buy another lens, or I just buy this camera, this is what's going to make me a great photographer. But I think it's quite analogous in a way to actually think about how, if you're an up and cut, go with me on this analogy because I hope this works for you. When you're a musician, you're first starting out. You'll play your first gig, and you might only have 10 people in that room, and you can cope with those 10 people. That's your level. But you gain more popularity, and you get into a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger room. You couldn't. That first gig, you wouldn't want to sit in front of an audience in Wembley with all that pressure that's on there. So there is an analogy there to where you can think about what camera you get, and actually getting used to the camera that you've got, and to find the limitations of that camera. And if you find your camera is actually holding you back for whatever reason, then that's probably a good time to then step up to another camera, step towards another camera, maybe for whatever reason. I mean, I've got a 5D Mark III. In a way, I've never really found its limitations. I won't say it's limitless, but with my own photography, I've never found its limitations. But through that sort of process, and I've had that camera for over 5 years now, I've really got to know it very well. So knowing what control does what, practicing using those functions as well, knowing which button does what. Later on I'm going to go through some suggestions which I specifically asked Reddit. Oh, I should have turned my notifications off. I thought I had done. Sorry about this. Yeah, I asked Reddit what was a useful function on a camera. What was some people's most useful function? So I'm going to go through a few of those later on, some of them were quite interesting. And one person put a huge paragraph about their camera. So I'm going to almost read that verbatim. Yeah, so know what control does what. Practicing using those functions until they become second nature. That means it's a bit like when you're driving a car. I mean, if you drive a car, you might be aware of this. Yeah, or a wee brake. I actually thought that was, I thought you meant that in a Scottish sense, Stuart. Just reading the comments. Yeah. Where was I right at that moment? Yeah, knowing what you control, what control does what, practicing using those functions, they really become second nature because, analogous to driving a car, because when you first learn to drive a car, especially if you do manual, it can seem quite baffling. I remember my dad said, actually, it's quite incredible, really. Once you get used to driving, it's almost like you don't even think about clutch control and bike point and gears and reverse and accelerator and how much you brake and how to use that. You don't think about it because you're so used to those controls. That's the sort of level you want to get to with your camera. You want to know exactly how what controls change the shutter speed, what control changes the aperture size, what control will change the focus. There are, I remember Stuart, actually, who's commented on here, saying he saw a video of me and he was like, he saw my finger flicking a particular control on the camera, and he asked me what that was, and I said, oh, that's just me disengaging manual focus or automatic focus, or I'm going to manual focus, or one of those two ways around. And I hadn't even noticed I did it because I did it without even thinking, because I just knew exactly where it was. I didn't have to stop. So knowing what these controls do, the way to find out what those controls do is to try out different settings on your camera, and that actually comes from you can play around with your camera, see what settings you can find in it. Most cameras have sort of presets as well. It all depends on what camera you actually have, what type of camera you have. If I'm talking from a DSLR point of view here, or even a bridge camera, most cameras have the ability to change the shutter and the aperture and ISO and all that type of thing. The best thing to do often is to check your camera's manual. And I remember having a really interesting conversation about this, like how, I would never look at somebody had told me they'd never look at the manual, and I was like, yeah, I wouldn't read it verbatim, but I would actually look at it, because you never know what you'll find in there. But maybe try different settings. That I would say the three main settings that I like to use and have used on a regular basis in different situations. One is shutter priority. Shutter priority generally allows you to it actually allows you to set the shutter speed and just control the shutter speed alone. That's just how fast the shutter opens and closes, and that actually, the camera does the rest of the work for you. Shutter priority is great if you want to do any sort of pan shots, if you want to get some motion in your photographs and you want to reduce the shutter speed down, or if you know that you want to freeze a frame and you want to keep the shutter speed up, the camera will do the rest for you. In fact, there's do I have one as an example? No, there was somebody on Reddit said they use automatic ISO, and that would basically set the ISO automatically for you. You don't have to think about it, and that's really good, specifically for very light conditions. There's always a play off for these sorts of things. There's always a little bit of a sacrifice with everything you do in photography, depending on the conditions you're photographing in. If it's like it is today, it's perfect sunshine, your settings generally are pretty okay. You don't really have to really push or pull any of them, but that's just something to think about. Yeah, so shutter priority, that's one useful control to maybe have a look at. Aperture priority is exactly the same thing. Instead of shutter, you just control the size of the aperture. Remember, the wider end of the aperture, the smaller the number, the wider the aperture will be. Means you have a less in focus, you have a shallow depth of field, and the opposite can be said for the narrow aperture size is up to with a larger number. You have more depth of field. There's a lot of there's a lot in that. I can cover this. This is more than I can cover in a. I'm kind of brushing over a lot of these things because there's more in these things. So with when it comes to the depth of field, it also depends on your focal length as well, and also depends on the available light. Because the more the narrow the aperture is, maybe you need to get a wider, a longer shutter speed, or a more light sensitive ISO. But you can really have a play around with those two things, shutter priority and aperture priority. I really recommend, and especially for those people who are really kind of stuck on. If you're stuck on manual and you're really finding it challenging, and because manual mode is the next thing I'm going to talk about. If you really get stuck on manual mode, I really say that it's a good idea to just go back to or go to shutter priority and aperture priority in certain conditions. Remember a street photography course I did several years ago. And his, because especially in street photography, if you see something and you want to get it really quickly, shutter priority is really useful, because you only have to you set the shutter speed, and then you can get a shot pretty quickly. So those two modes, they can be overlooked quite often with it being quote unquote cheating, which I find quite hilarious. But those two are quite useful. And the third one I'll just mention is this manual mode. Manual mode is where you actually just control all three settings. I remember when I got my first digital SLR. Now I did use a couple of times. I did use a film SLR. I didn't use it very often because it wasn't my camera, it was my mum's. That's when I first got my hand on an SLR camera, and I was really fascinated. And I can remember getting that DSLR. I bought it off of a friend of mine. And the first thing I wanted to do was long exposure, because I knew that I could control the aperture. And I just remember getting it and just playing around with the settings and having a really good fun with it, and especially with digital. Now, I always say shoot with purpose, shoot with an idea, have a plan to shoot, plan, then shoot it, and then review it, and go through those steps. Plan, shoot, review, go through that sort of step over and over and over again, and you'll build up a good photographic knowledge, and you'll become more confident with your photography, and also you learn so much as you go along. But I had a point there. Thank you, brain. What was the point? But yeah, just using manual mode, you have control over everything. The point was the fact that if you have, I say shoot with purpose. Don't shoot too many. When you can shoot, 100. Why only shoot? Why you can just shoot 10? Shoot the photographs that are actually meaningful, rather than shooting absolutely hundreds and hundreds of photographs which you're never going to look at. But actually, when you're playing around, when you're learning, you could even just get a spare memory card that you just put into your camera that you've got there, and you just wipe it at the end of every session. You're not trying to review everything that you photograph, but you might get used to gets you used to the settings of your camera. It gets you to understand what each setting does, and it also gets you used to where the controls are. I mean, I've looked back at my archive, which stretches back over 10 years now, and I've gone back to some of the old photos, and I really like some of them, but some of them, goodness me, they weren't very good compared to what my standards are now. But yeah, so this is today's topic. I'm just going on a slightly rambling conversation today, or a slightly rambling conversation. I did a podcast earlier, you can tell, can't you? On a slightly rambling episode today, just talking about how, getting to know your camera. How well do you actually know your camera? I think it's really important to really understand, to really know what your camera is capable of. But just carry on with this. And I mentioned earlier that I actually had asked Reddit for some of the question of what was the most useful function on the camera that they found most useful. Did it have a couple of subreddits. I picked 4. There's 4, and there's one post that I want to almost read out verbatim. I'm going to read that one out pretty much verbatim. But the Yes, the first one, I think the person that actually told me this was quite was trying to be quite funny, but they said quite obviously said they said the shutter button, the most used function. Yes, thank you very much for that. But it's actually fun, interesting to say that, it's interesting to point out that on most cameras, and I'm sure you know this, but I'm going to say it anyway, the shutter button also acts as your focus. So you generally most shutter buttons have a double click. So you lightly press the shutter button, and it will just depress slightly, and that generally will control your automatic focus. And there was somebody who said they didn't like it. And in fact, the third one on here is about focusing, and actually the next two are about focusing in general. The next one was manual focus. They like the idea of manual focusing, and the reason for it is because it was they had more control. Autofocus is all depends on where you're pointing the camera, where the point of focus is in your camera. Some cameras are very fixed about that. Some cameras actually have a control. I've got a control on the back of my camera where I can move the point of focus when I do automatic focusing. But manual focusing is like they said it gave me more control. I added to that it also is less draining on the battery because of course focus your lens autofocus is entirely taken electricity or taken power from your camera's battery. That's where it's being powered from. So it can be less draining. So if you're on a longer session or you're going out for a long walk, and you know that you're not going to be able to charge your batteries for a day or two, it may be better to stick on manual focus. There was also somebody else raised something called back button focusing. So talking about the shutter button. So when the shutter button, you can semi-depress it and it will be automatic, it'll be focusing. On some cameras, they also have a button on the back which does exactly the same thing. Which sounds a bit. When I first saw it, I thought, well, what's the point in that? Because you can just do the shutter button. And what they say is that they find pressing the shutter button halfway, waiting for the camera to focus, and then pushing the button further to release the shutter, they find that unnatural. I also think it's a certain amount of pressure you put on the button, and it could be that if you get knocked or jogged or you just press it, you end up taking a photograph anyway. So it's actually quite useful to use the back button focusing. Not every camera has it. Most DSLRs do. I know mine does. I might start using it in the future. So because it feels unnatural for this person, they're less likely to catch the moment with fast-moving subjects, especially, or candid photography. So when you're using the shutter, it doesn't really. The shutter focus is handy for static subjects rather than moving subjects. The back button is much better, so you can hold that focus and then you press the shutter button. It's just something to get used to. Just the last one, because this is quite interesting. It's something that I actually already mentioned, which is aperture priority. It all depends on, because this is the another AV mode is what this person has specifically said here. And AV is the aperture priority. I believe that's the Canon aperture priority. And I'm a Canon owner as well. They can control the aperture and don't have to worry about much else. That's the thing. I go back to that again. Is if you're using shutter priority and using aperture priority, you can just think about one function in your camera at once, and that actually really does then help if you get used to what the shutter priority does and what the aperture priority does. It really helps you build the skills and the knowledge of how to move on to manual and move back again. So yeah, that's it. But I just wanted to read this last paragraph. I tried to read it verbatim. So these are reactions to a question I asked on Reddit about what was the most useful function on a camera. Today I'm just going through how well do you know your camera and how important it is to understand your camera to get the best photographs. You know how understanding those most important functions in your camera and how that can really help you improve your photography. But this person specifically said, and I said I would actually, I did say that I'd probably pretty much read it out verbatim. So I'll read this. So yeah, they said, I don't know that there is any one thing that they use most often. A camera is a system. The one thing that is most helpful changes depending on the light situation. So they have a mirrorless camera. So a mirrorless camera is a DSLR, has a flip up, has a mirror inside it. Yeah, won't go into technicalities, but mirrorless cameras don't have that. They say it's exposure simulation. Now that just basically simulates what the exposure will look like. So you just put the settings in, you can actually see what it will look like. And they said while they're always a total meter whore, so they're saying about how much they focus on their light meter, I believe, they do use exposure simulation to fine-tune things in their photograph. So the exposure simulation is really quite a useful function. I know that I don't have that on my camera, and that again won't be on everybody's cameras. So once they have the exposure settings dialed in for the main meter reading, for mirrorless, they also rely on focus peaking, which I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to read what that is. For manual focus or fully manual adapted lenses. So there's different types of lenses going on there. There's also Fuji mirrorless film simulation modes. There's lots of technical information here. The point is that you know, I like the whole of point of the camera itself is a system. That the controls you have in the camera all play off and balance off each other. It's the exposure, what's known as the exposure triangle. Something I really want to get into. Something I really want to start to really explore in these shows and other material which I'm going to be producing. Is that triangle? Because if you can understand how that triangle works and understand the camera as a system that works together, then you're only going to get better photography. But yeah, that's today's topic, getting to know your camera. Has anybody got any questions? Anybody watching? Goodo. And I've noticed that we're on 26 minutes already, William. You really have gone longer than usual. But today's challenge, I'm going to go back to the challenge I did last week again. I'm just going to go straight onto the challenge. Post one photo on social media, no edits, no filters. What responses do you get? Yeah, be quite interesting to see what people make of it all. But yeah, I'm going to leave that as that's the end of the show. As always, thanks for watching. It's been a slightly different show. Every show is ever so slightly different, I feel. But thanks for watching. Next week, we're going to be looking at how to create amazing landscape photography, or how to create amazing landscape photographs. I've actually got it in front of me on the screen here. That's going to be on the 21st of July, if you can quite believe that. Yeah, we're on the 14th already. And this show is here every week, Wednesday, 7 p.m. Thanks very much for watching. I'll get myself back on the screen briefly. Have a good week. Thanks for everybody who checked in. And I'll see you in a week's time.